Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar, CMMC 2.0, Technical Solutions Deep Dive. I am Leslie Crowley, an account manager at Windvale, and I am pleased to reintroduce Heather Engel, Director of Strategic Security at Trac. Today, she will discuss implementation for major CMMC control families, important controls contractors should know, and some technical solutions including outsourcing or managed services, handling everything in-house, and Enclave segmentation solutions. A little bit about our speaker before we start. Heather has 20 years of cybersecurity and compliance experience with the DoD and supporting the DIP. She holds industry certifications including CISSP, CISM, and CISA, and is a recognized subject matter expert in NIST frameworks, FAR and DFAR cybersecurity requirements, FedRAMP, and more. And lastly, if you're new to Windvale, we are a leading contract consulting firm and have advised thousands of companies of all sizes and industries with their GSA schedule contracts, from new GSA schedule offers to post-award maintenance and compliance support. During this presentation, feel free to submit your questions to the questions section of your webinar controls, and we will devote some time at the end to address as many questions as we can. We are recording this webinar for later viewing and your reference. I will now pass it over to Heather.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Leslie. Today, we're going to talk about some of the technical solutions. So the webinar that we did last month, we covered just a basic overview of CMMC 2.0, what that means for you and what that means for your security strategy now. The important thing for this webinar is that you did not necessarily have needed to attend the first one to understand what we're going to talk about today. And again, if there are questions on differences between CMMC 1.0 and 2.0, we can try to answer those towards the end of the broadcast today. But what we're going to focus on today are some of the questions that we get asked most frequently about implementation. How do I interpret this control? What's going to be the best solution for my organization when I'm handling controlled and classified information? So with that in mind, this is our agenda for today. So first, we're going to talk about the controls and break down some of the most important controls and how do you identify the controls that are the most important for your organization. We'll talk about implementation and interpretation because they're two different things. And then we'll talk about some of the different ways that you might choose to get some assistance, whether it's with managing your infrastructure in general, or whether it's just segmenting and isolating your controlled and classified information and understanding and figuring out what the best way to protect that would be. Again, as Leslie said, we'd encourage you to submit your questions using the dashboard there that you have as part of your meeting dashboard. All right, so let's start with talking about the controls breakdown. A little bit over a year ago, the DoD released the scoring values for each of the NIST 800-171 controls. So just to recap, we have 110 NIST 800-171 controls. What has happened now is we have a numerical value assigned to each of those. So it's a point value of either 1 point, 3 points, or 5 points. When you are creating a SPURS score, you're going to start with a score of 110, and then you're going to subtract the numerical value of controls that you haven't implemented. So if you're doing a little bit of math in your head, you'll very quickly realize that you can go negative on your SPURS score pretty fast, especially if you haven't done some of these basic controls, because if there's one 5-point control that I haven't done, I'm subtracting 5 points from my score of 110. So there's a little bit of confusion in the industry, or at least there was initially, that all of these point values should add up to 100, and that's not the case at all. We're actually working backwards. We're assuming that you're starting with a perfect score of 110, and then we're subtracting. The minimum score would be negative 203. So the point values for all 110 controls total up to 203. If you haven't implemented any of those, then that would be your score. So in the context of risk, some controls are going to be more impactful than others. And this is going to be very specific to your organization. right? We can sort out and we can say, oh, these are the 5-point controls. I need to implement all of these 5-point controls, which is true. But one of the things that we look at, particularly when you're investing a lot into a security project or developing a security program, yes, we want to be compliant, but we don't just want to check boxes. We also want to implement controls in a way that's going to reduce our risk level. And we'll talk a little bit about the different types of risk and how we do that. But one of the things that we know, just having seen what's going on in our industry over the last several months, and even particularly in the last 3 months, is a marked increase in ransomware. We're seeing new types of ransomware that are destructive, where instead of just holding your data hostage, you're actually going to have that data be destroyed if you don't pay the ransom, as well as threats to release your data if you don't pay the ransom. So we're in the context of implementing a program like this, NIST 800-171 requires a pretty good size investment of time, level of effort, potentially money if you don't have the tools and things to do this. So we don't just want to do it to check boxes, right? We want to actually reduce our risk of things like ransomware that could have a much bigger impact on our organization as a whole, especially if we do business with companies or organizations other than the DoD. So very simply, the most effective ways to protect against malware, specifically ransomware, is going to be multi-factor authentication in as many places as you can get it, right? So if you have Microsoft 365, and that's where you get your email and your Teams and data sharing, we want to put multi-factor authentication onto our webmail. We want to put it on our authentication if you're using Microsoft Azure. If you're doing any kind of remote access, we want to put multi-factor authentication through your remote access, because what that's going to do is it's going to put that extra step, that little extra check and balance between someone being able to access with just a username and password and having to have that third or that second level of authentication that might not be quite as easily guessed or duplicated. The second thing that we look at when we're talking about protecting the organization as a whole is segmentation. So we can segment in a couple different ways. We can segment our network as a whole. We can segment data through different file sharing permissions. So an example of network segmentation as a whole would be one of the controls requires us to separate voice over IP traffic from network traffic. So we could have segmentation in that way. Potentially, if we have an organization that has multiple lines of business, maybe one of their business focuses on the commercial and one focuses on government. Well, if employees don't cross over and don't work on both sides of that business, we could potentially segment that way. And then we would save the commercial side from having to implement all of the same controls that we have to put in place for our government business. We can get down to a very granular level where we start to look at data loss prevention strategies, where we actually segment our file structure, we segment our folders, and we can do that either physically or we can do it logically. So physically, we might have a couple of different file servers where we're storing data, or maybe we have one shared environment and we're separating logically through access controls on various folders and shared sites. The third thing to look at when we're looking at reducing risk to the organization in terms of either data loss or denial of service, which is what a ransomware attack would cause potentially, is your antivirus, anti-malware filtering. So we want to make sure that we're not allowing the bad stuff to get in. That's very simply what we do with things like Microsoft Defender, things like McAfee and some of the other tools that you can put in place to look for those new strains of malware and viruses that we see in the wild. And then finally, this last one we're going to spend some time talking about, because in the context of NIST 800-171, the only requirement that you have as far as backups go is that if you are backing up controlled and classified information, it needs to be encrypted, right? Or we need to protect the confidentiality of that backup And the easiest way to do that is going to be with encryption. But one of the things that we advise our clients on is when you are looking at your most effective protections against ransomware, one of those things, assuming that you have all these other things in place and they've failed, the easiest way to recover without having to go through the dialogue of should we pay the ransom or not is to have a really solid set of backups. And they can be backed up to cloud. They could potentially backed up offline to tape. But remember, if you're backing up to a cloud, there needs to be some segmentation there so that the ransomware that potentially would infect your infrastructure doesn't also travel out to infect your backups. But again, this isn't something that's necessarily a requirement for the DoD or for NIST 800-171 as much as it is just a general best practice to be able to recover should you find yourself in a position where you've had a ransomware situation. So what do we take away from this slide? Number one, we want to look at what the biggest risks to our infrastructure are. What is the goal that we have in implementing any type of security program in the organization? And yes, compliance is going to be a goal, but we always want to try to look beyond just checking the box, right? And that's going to be a theme that you'll hear me talk about throughout this presentation today. Your goals may change depending on whether your infrastructure or your security program is immature or if it's more mature. So, if we have an immature security infrastructure, maybe we have users that are working in a virtual distributed way and everyone has a Microsoft 365 account. And that might have been fine until you ran into having to do some government work and starting to comply with NIST 800-171. But that's what we would consider then in this context to be a little bit more immature of a security program. Something that's more mature, as an auditor, I said this the last time, one of the things that we look for from year to year and when we're conducting audits are one, the longevity of the security program, and two, we look at how it has changed and improved over time. So if I audit a system and then I come back the next year and I audit the same system, I want to see improvements to things that we identified the first time. And that doesn't mean that it needs to be perfect, but as long as I'm seeing some improvements, right, I'm feeling a little bit better about the audit and about this company's security program. When we look at these goals again, and we'll do a little bit more of a discussion as far as what specific controls within NIST we want to look at, but really understanding the maturity level, the risk in terms of the type of information we have, right? And so an example there would be, we may have CUI, we might also have export controlled information, which is a category of CUI. Well, export controls are controlled information or ITARs information is going to require additional layers of protection, right? So if we're getting information, let's say it's contract information that's marked as CUI, then that's one thing. But if we have information that we know is export controlled or ITARs, there are additional regulations beyond just the DFARS clause and the NIST controls that we should have been doing all along anyway, because export controlled regulations have been around for a long time. And they vary a little bit. They were just recently updated in the last 2 years. But again, that's something that when you're looking at what's the goal of implementing these controls, some controls are going to be more impactful in the context of your greater risk. All right, so let's look at our next slide now, and we'll continue just talking about what's most important. So in the SPURS scoring model, there's 42 5-point controls. Many of those are going to be basic controls, meaning that they're foundations of your information technology regardless of business risk. And so we can look at that, right, and we can further break down, well, what if I'm talking about CMMC level 1? We can basically cut that number almost in half to say that these are the controls that we're going to have to implement under level 1. They're the same controls for the most part. They're 5-point controls, but today we're focused on level 3, so we're not going to get into that as much. But many of these controls are basic, so they're things that you should be doing regardless of whether you have DoD contracts, right? Things like access control, things like having a firewall, some things around physical security and personnel security. These are things that you're generally going to be doing anyway, even if you don't have any indicators of a more secure or a more mature security program, like having a comprehensive SIM tool under auditing. So when we start to look at these controls specifically, we've got access control, right? Identifying authorized users and limiting access to the system. Well, if we go back here, multi-factor authentication falls under that. If we continue to think about what our biggest risks are, access control and boundary protection, controlling our boundary, controlling what's coming in and what's going out and who has access to data, that's going to be one of our biggest risks. That's going to be one of our biggest wins, is really getting a handle and locking down who has access to information. Configuration management is another one in the context of risk, because understanding what's on our system and how systems normally behave is going to be absolutely critical for us to understand how we then identify abnormal. I feel like when I talk to clients a lot of the time, configuration management is one of the most overlooked controls. And there's a number of 5-point controls in the CM section, but this is one of those things where a lot of our clients will tell us that we have the system, it's been configured a certain way, but it's inconsistent across the organization. So what that does then is it prevents me, or it makes it more difficult for me to understand what normal behavior on the system looks like. So I'll give you an example. If one person has the system as it's been issued to them by IT, and they're using that system, they haven't installed any additional software because let's say maybe they don't have local admin access, versus someone who sits across the hall from them that does have local admin access, and now maybe they've installed Spotify because they want to listen to music while they work, or they've installed some of the apps that you can get from the Windows App Store. Well, now we have two workstations that behave very differently, and they look very different behind the scenes in terms of the data that they're passing and what they're connecting to. So then it becomes more difficult for us to understand what normal traffic looks like, and then we're more likely to miss the warning signs of abnormal traffic. So again, configuration management, and nobody that works in IT, and I'll be the first person to tell you, I grew up on True64 Unix, and then I worked with Solaris systems for a while, and then right into Microsoft Active Directory and Azure. There is nobody that works in technical, in a very technical role like that likes doing documentation. We just don't like to write things down. We know what we did, but we just don't like to put it down in a policy. However, there are tools that you can use to make sure that you're capturing images, that you have an understanding of what your baseline is supposed to look like. And then if you have a breach and you're able to trace that to a specific workstation, you can compare the snapshot of what that workstation is supposed to look like, and you can very quickly identify where malware might be present. So I'll stress that again, configuration management to me is absolutely going to be one of your most important controls. And as I mentioned, several of those 42 5-point controls are in that section. When we talk about what's most important in the context of risk, this next one is a little bit of a hot topic, right? So let's look at our users. Users are an integral part of any information system, but they are also the least predictable in terms of system input. There's an old joke with IT professionals that the system would just be perfect if only we didn't have users. But then we wouldn't have a need for the system, and there probably wouldn't be much of a need for us as IT experts. So keeping in mind that your users are going to be the least predictable system input in the way that they behave, right? I understand how a piece of software is going to behave generally. Users, it's a little bit harder to put my finger on that. So one of the things that you need to look at is, in the context of risk, in the context of your organization and whether your security program is mature, what is your corporate culture as far as your users, right? I've worked with a number of clients over the years who have had senior level executives at the top of the food chain for this company, and they've refused to put complex passwords in place because it's too hard, or they haven't wanted to do multi-factor authentication because it adds an extra step. And then I've worked with other organizations where everyone across the organization is very security minded. And so when we look at those 5-point controls, 2 out of the 3 controls in the awareness and training section are 5-point controls. The third one is a 1-point control. So that means there's 11 points just in that section. Now, what does your training need to look like? If you have the kind of organization where maybe your users are a little bit less focused or they're a little bit less security minded, maybe we need to do a little bit more intensive training. It's not going to work to just send them a phishing email once a month and see who clicks on it and then do some remedial training. Maybe we need to sit down with a series of brown bag lunches, or we need to have actual conversations with our users to start to really help them understand how this is applicable to their lives, not just professionally, but personally. Whereas if we have an organization where the users are a little more security minded, maybe we don't need to do quite as much. And so what I'm starting to do, if you've heard what I just described, that's one of the ways that we start to talk about how we interpret a control. And I'll get into that a little bit more. The last one here, that's really a foundation of an information technology program is auditing. And again, same as configuration, we have to understand what's normal so that we can identify abnormal. And in any information system, no matter how small, there are hundreds of thousands of actions that are happening, whether it's connections in, whether it's outputs, whether it's users attempting to log into the system, it's users moving around and doing their jobs. The tools that are available today, whether it's something that's built in that you're using as part of your Microsoft program, whether you're layering on different tools, maybe you're not a Microsoft shop, maybe you're primarily working on Apple devices, or you're working primarily in a Unix, Linux environment. Whatever you're layering on there, the tools get smarter and smarter every day. And so they have far exceeded our capacity, right, as a human to go in and look at log files and say, I wonder what that means. I'm going to click through that and I'm going to try to figure it out. So these are the things that, and again, in the auditing section, there's a number of 5-point controls, but these are the things that they're foundations of an information technology program, regardless of your business risk. These are the things that you should have in place. All right, so let's now take a look here at a few additional controls as far as how we break them down. If we look at those basic controls that we have as part of NIST 800-171, the intent of the media protection section is so that we know where our data is. And for anyone on the call that ever worked on a DoD site or has worked with the military, probably 15 or so years ago, the military had a huge problem with thumb drives, right, or removable media. And so it was just decided that we're not going to use these anymore. And part of that was because they were being used to introduce malware inputs into a closed system, but also because users had a tendency to say, I need a copy of this. I'm going to put something on this thumb drive. I'm going to go share it with this person over here who needs to see it, or I'm going to take it to this meeting and we're going to put it up on the big screen. But then it was lost, right? Then that thumb drive was laying around. Nobody really knew what was on it. Nobody was aware of where that data had traveled. And so one of the goals with DFAR 7012 and NIST 800-171 is so that we have a good understanding of where our data is. That's where media protection comes in. That's where some of the auditing comes in as well, and data loss prevention controls. When we look at boundary defenses, this is stuff that we've already talked about, segmenting our information as much as possible, limiting the assets that have access to this information, whether that asset is a device or whether it's a user. You can always look at limiting the access to things and segmenting information as a way to sort of cut or reduce your losses in the event of a data breach. You want to look at the absolute minimum requirements that are necessary for people to do their jobs and for the system to function and for your business processes to function the way that they need to. System integrity, we talked about this one a little bit. This is your antivirus, anti-malware, defending against attacks and fixing flaws, right? So system integrity is not just about installing antivirus software. There's also a lot of overlap with configuration management, because when I build an image of a system, and that's going to be my configured system, that's going to be the image that I use, well, we all know Microsoft releases patches on a weekly basis, sometimes more than that. Any software that you have on the devices, patches are released on a fairly regular basis. So your system integrity and flaw remediation is not just in that SI section, it also translates over to your configuration management process. How do you make sure your images are staying up to date? All right, so let's talk a little bit about risk management. There's two sections in NIST 800-171 that I think get overlooked a lot, right? They're a little bit smaller, they only have a few controls, and that is risk management and security configuration management, or security protection. So this is where we're looking at conducting a risk assessment. This is where we do security controls assessment. And these sections, a lot of our clients have a tendency to want to gloss over them. So the security assessment and the risk management or risk assessment section. Again, this is a basic tenet of your security program, because when you look at the NIST 800-171 controls, and you'll see this on the next slide, they're not prescriptive, or they're descriptive, not prescriptive. So in other words, it's going to describe what you should do, but it's not going to tell you what to do and how to do it. So in that case, how do we make that decision, right? And it goes back to risk management. Understanding the risk that is posed by your information systems to your mission and to your company as a whole is how you determine and how you start to implement these controls. So when we talk about the risk management framework, right, when we conduct risk assessments, we typically will use NIST 830 and NIST 800 TAC 37. And many of you on the call have probably seen this triangle, right, where organizational is at the top, mission and business processes are in the middle, and then the base of the triangle is information systems. So when we look at this, we want to look at risks to the organization, and those are things that we typically can't control. So a great example of this would be, I spent all of last year within my organization preparing to certify at CMMC level 3. I'm good to go. Well, an organizational risk is that government and regulatory compliance could change, which is exactly what happened. The second one, as far as risk to my mission and business processes, this is where we look at what critical business processes are in place. How do we make money? Okay, is the simplest, maybe a little bit crass way to put it, but what are the things that drive revenue for our organization? What are the things that keep us operating, right? So it could be payroll, it could be government contracts, it might be manufacturing widgets. Those fall into, and risks to those types of things fall into the mission and business process category. And then finally, we're able to then look at our information systems and say, based on the risk to this business process, I understand that this IT asset is the main device that's supporting my most critical business process. So I'm going to put the most effort into protecting that specific piece of my information system. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next control. But understanding, when we look at these 5-point controls, understanding why risk management is important and understanding why security assessment is important really contributes to that overall security maturity that I talked about in the very beginning. All right, so let's take a look at implementation and interpretation. I already said this, controls are descriptive, not prescriptive. You have to implement based on risk. Here's your triangle again, the organization, the mission, and the information system. So let's look at some examples. If you all can recall, and I don't know how old everyone on the call is, right? But if you can recall back when you were in maybe elementary school, maybe it was late elementary school, early middle school, and you had to do those English exercises where you were given a sentence, right? You had to diagram the sentence and you had to underline your adverbs and you had to underline your adjectives. This is a great way, and some of you are probably rolling your eyes thinking how glad you are that you didn't have to do that anymore. I'm going to tell you, you should still do that. Because what we can do now is we can look at these controls and we can say, what are the things that are in here that are undefined. Okay, so in this example, 3.13.2, what does effective mean? Well, the DoD is not going to tell you. NIST 800-171 doesn't really tell you. You have to decide in the context of risk, what is effective information security architectural design? What does that mean? And if you go back to my example of a virtual distributed organization where everybody just has an account in Microsoft 365, that might be effective if what you're doing is providing services to your clients and you don't have access to critical information, right? We're not doing anything that if we lost our client data, it would be earth-shattering, it would be disastrous. But then when we start to look at if we're handling CUI or we're handling any kind of sensitive data, we're handling our corporate confidential data, that might not be enough, right? Because we don't have enough visibility. So when you look at a control, the first thing you want to do is identify the things that are descriptive, that are open to interpretation. And then we have to say, how do we determine what is effective? You know, another example, 3.14.1, this is from the System and Information Integrity section. This one has a lot of things that we could potentially define, right? So identify and report information system flaws. Well, okay, identification is relatively straightforward. I get an email from Adobe that says an Adobe product that's on my workstation requires an update. Okay, so if I don't have the ability to fix that myself, who's reporting it? Or let's say it's going to my centralized IT division. Who do they need to report that to? And then when it says correct information system flaws, first of all, how do we define a flaw? How do we define a timely manner, right? It could be, let's say 24 hours for critical flaws. It could be 7 business days or 5 to 7 business days for moderate level flaws. Maybe it's much longer than that for low level alerts or low level findings. But the correct part of it is also open to interpretation, right? So correcting means we're fixing it. Let's say we have a legacy system, and we see this a lot in manufacturing. Let's say there's a legacy system that I don't have the ability to patch or upgrade, and I've worked with a lot of clients who have this. There are still a number of retail establishments that run very outdated versions of Windows because that's what their retail payment systems run on. So correcting an information system flaw might vary based on the system itself. If it's a manufacturing system that we don't just go in and apply patches because maybe it's been around for 15 years or 20 years and we don't fully understand all the dependencies, well, maybe we don't just randomly apply a patch to that could potentially break the entire structure. And then we're left trying to figure out how we, if you go up on the slide, we've just put a business process at risk, right? And so when you're looking at the implementation and interpretation of these controls, this is how we're going to do it. And it's very often good to have a couple of different opinions. So if you have more than one person in your IT shop, it's always good to get a second opinion. There are a number, a multitude, there's no shortage of companies out there that are clamoring to help you with this. And so you can always ask. You can go to other peers in your industry and see what they're doing. There are great user groups out there that talk about DFARS and that talk about NIST and interpretation. There's a very solid Reddit community that you can get on, where you can post questions and interpretations and just kind of get do some crowdsourced feedback. So again, then when we interpret our controls and then we go on to implement them, you have a lot of flexibility in how you do that, which in some ways makes things easier and in some ways makes things much, much harder. So let's talk about the implementation for a second before we move on. Now we can break this down in a very logical way and we can spend a lot of time underlining our adjectives and things like that. The bottom line is most of us don't have time to sit here and ponder and articulate how we want to do every single control and make these decisions. So this is where best practices come in, right? There's a number of best practices that you can use. DISA, which is the Defense Information Security or Systems Agency. They've been around forever. You can look at the DISA STIGs, which are the Secure Technical Implementation Guidelines. You can look at Microsoft best practices. You can look at the best practices from NIST. NIST has guidelines for securing and configuring almost everything that you could think of out there. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can start to document and implement these controls. But for the ones that you get stuck on, or for the controls that maybe there isn't a really clear way to put them into place, spend a little bit more time on the interpretation and looking at it in the context of your risk, particularly risk up here, to the business process or to the mission. Your information system is going to dramatically impact the risk to your business processes, how you secure that information, and then your business processes and your mission are impacted by the organizational risks. So just keep that in mind. Don't spend too much time getting worked up about it. Look at it in a really logical way, and go to some of those forums. Ask for help if you need it. All right, so we're going to move on from the interpretation and implementation. I'm happy to take questions on that if there are any. But now we're going to move into different types of security strategy and why you might want to consider working or different avenues that you could take to secure your infrastructure. So we're typically going to bucket almost everything that's available out there into 3 different security strategies, right? One would be in-house, one would be managed services, and then the other would be an enclave solution. So let's talk about what in-house looks like. This is where we have internal personnel who are managing and maintaining our information systems. It's a do-it-yourself approach. And I don't mean that to sound, like do-it-yourself, like we're just kind of hacking things together. That's not it at all. But what it does mean is that primarily the responsibility for your information systems and your information security falls on personnel that work for the organization. And some of you are probably thinking, I would love to outsource some of this stuff, but my management team won't allow me to do that. And probably all of you who do any type of in-house maintenance are thinking, wow, I wish we had more resources, right? I wish I had another person to help me do this. Those, obviously are some of the things that you need to look at and understand. You can read, you don't even have to Google it. Probably everybody's aware that we have a shortage of knowledge in information technology and information security. So it can be tricky to find the right skill set. And again, we are not in an industry where you can possibly know everything about everything. So understanding, in-house what your capabilities are, what the time that you have available is to do this is really important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So the second one would be managed services, right? This is where we work with a third party. Typically it's called an MSP or managed services provider. You could also have a managed security services provider. So that would be an MSSP. And that's going to be a little more specialized, right? An MSP, a managed services provider, is typically going to be in the role of helping you set up, manage, maintain your licensing for your infrastructure. Depending on what you contract for, they could provide your help desk. They could be doing configuration management for you. If you're talking just about managed security services or an MSSP, that might be where we've chosen to just outsource our auditing, right? So good example, you could use a company like Rapid7, you could use a company like Event Tracker, where you can outsource just the auditing to those companies, and then you have a 24/7 SOC that's monitoring your information. That's something that unless you're working for a pretty big company with a large IT team, most companies are not going to have 24/7 eyes on glass security operations centers that are happening. So again, your security strategy doesn't necessarily have to be, blue, green, or purple. It can be a combination of these things. In any case with managed services, this is a partnership approach, right? And typically what we see is there's at least a few people or maybe one person who's overseeing IT, and they're partnering and they're the primary point of contact with the MSP or the MSSP. So you do have to have a little bit of skin in the game. You know, you're not just pushing it off to that third party and washing your hands of it. Finally, when we look at Enclave, this is something where your data, and this specifically really applies to sensitive information, right, which we would categorize CUI certainly as sensitive information. Other types in other industries might include retail, right? If I'm processing credit cards, maybe I want to segment or isolate my credit card processing to an Enclave environment. This just means that data is being held outside of my company's internal boundary. So in other words, if I'm using an Enclave to process CUI, I'm leaving the internal boundary of my business network, and I'm going and I'm processing that data and I'm storing it somewhere else. So then that relieves a lot of the burden on me to implement all of the controls that we've just spent, 20 or 30 minutes talking about. This is a very, very, very much a business process focused approach. This isn't going to work for everybody. For example, if you have your entire company and everybody in the company is handling and processing controlled and classified information, this might not make sense for you. Or if you have a very specific type of process that drives revenue and you can't do it in an Enclave, maybe you need things that you can't put in the Enclave, that's not going to work for you. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through these next few. So let's look at the pros and cons of in-house management. First, you have total control over your systems. You control your systems, your boundary, your data flow, and your security strategy. You can be responsive to changes in your business process and your business needs and your risk. So let's say now you've won a contract that requires you to implement more security, or that contract says now all of a sudden everyone that touches this system has to do this level and this type of training. Could happen, right? So you can be a little bit more responsive to that when you're in-house. It might be a little bit more difficult to work through a managed service provider. It might be less responsive. A lot of that is going to depend on your service level agreement, which we'll talk about on the next slide. The cons of in-house management, we touched on these a little bit already. It's going to require expertise in multiple disciplines. Generally, the same person who is configuring and locking down and creating group policies in your Active Directory isn't always the best person to be configuring your firewall rule sets and managing and maintaining the segmentation. Sometimes it is, but generally, it requires expertise in multiple disciplines. So if you are a 1 or 2 person show in terms of IT, in-house management can get tricky, right? Because you don't know what you don't know. And we very often work with clients who have a fantastic security staff, but they've been at the same company for 5 or 10 years. And if we think back to 2012, look at how much technology has changed. Look at how much threats have changed in the last 10 years. And if your company isn't great about sending you to training, if you're not great about participating in forums to learn what's going on, it can be really challenging because you just don't know what you don't know. And so again, expertise in multiple disciplines can be tricky. One thing here, you might still require external support for specific tasks. A great example would be forensics. If you have had a data breach, very rarely do we see companies that have a full-on support team that's capable of containment, eradication, and forensic capture in-house. Because for most people, the risk of a breach is high, but the risk of requiring all those things is low enough that it's not cost effective. Okay, so just something to think about there. Even if you're managing everything in-house and it's going really smoothly, it's worth taking a look at what are some specific tasks that we might want to outsource. And if we decided that we needed to outsource that, especially in an emergency situation like a data breach, who would we go to? So just some things to think about there. Second, let's look at the managed services, the pros and cons, right? So we already said that it can be difficult. It can be difficult to know what you don't know. One of the things with managed services is you get experience and expertise across a shared cost model. So my company is using a managed service provider. This company over here is using a managed service provider. And we have the same person, right, that we call if we have questions. Maybe it's an account manager or something like that. I'm sharing the cost of that person across a number of different companies. I'm also getting access to a deeper bench of experience and expertise. We already said that it can be difficult for one person to know everything and to be an expert in everything. With a managed services model, I'm able to tap into some different levels and maybe get expertise that I don't need all the time, right? If I'm standing up a new firewall, let's say I'm replacing my old firewall with a new Palo Alto. Well, I don't need someone who's an expert in setting up Palo Alto firewalls on my staff all the time, but it sure is nice to have that person for the, for the couple days or week that it takes me to configure it and make sure that it's locked down the way that I want it. Another pro of using a managed services model is you can often choose a service level, right? You don't always have to be all or nothing. Maybe you contract with them to provide help desk support, and that help desk support allows you a certain number of tickets per month. Or maybe you want to outsource the whole thing and they handle everything for you. Again, looking at and understanding the service level agreement of what you're getting is really critical when you're outsourcing. Cons, I can tell you I've been doing this for a really long time, and there's a huge variance in the quality of managed service providers out there. What's the best way to find one where you're going to get quality service? Typically, it's going to be asking your peers in the industry for recommendations. It can be tricky because you could Google managed services provider and you'll get 15 companies, probably all within your same zip code, that are gonna vary wildly in terms of the level of service that they provide and the level of attentiveness that you're gonna get. One of the other things that we see really often is they may be unfamiliar with your compliance requirements. So, I live in the Norfolk Hampton Roads area of Virginia. We have hundreds, probably thousands of companies down here that do work with the DoD. So managed service providers, particularly the ones that I work with in this area, are very familiar with DFARS compliance requirements. But if you move outside of an area like mine, where we have 7 military bases right within a 30-mile radius, it's a lot harder to find a managed service provider who understands the compliance requirements that you may have as a DoD provider. And again, when you work with managed services, it's going to require oversight from someone in your organization. You can't just sign the contract and walk away and let the managed service provider handle everything. You have to stay on top of it just to make sure that, number one, you're getting what you're paying for, but also it's important to really have some oversight and some understanding of your own IT infrastructure. That's something that we can't stress enough. You still have to have someone who's involved with the service provider, even if you choose a service level where you outsource almost the entire thing. All right, so now let's look at an Enclave solution. And again, this is something that might prove to be more cost-effective than either an in-house solution or a managed service solution. You're going to limit your data storage on your business network, and you're going to reduce your scope. So one of the things that I talked about last time with CMMC 2.0 is now we finally have the scoping guidance that service providers and companies in the DIB have been asking for 2 years. So the scoping guidance comes out, and now it tells us how to classify assets. And what a lot of us got was things that we weren't expecting. So with an Enclave solution, you can potentially move your data off of your business network into somebody else's network, make it at least partially someone else's problem, and then reduce the scope of security that you have to apply to your infrastructure. So in that way, this might be more cost effective. There's a number of different things to look at. Licensing models. What are you getting for your with the Enclave solution? Is it a complete package? Are you getting partial? Are you getting technical controls? Are you getting documentation? So these are all questions that you should ask if you're considering an Enclave solution. What does the documentation look like? What do I have to do to the documentation? If I'm doing this for compliance, what's the level of effort required for me to get from point A to point B, which would be, compliant, that would pass an audit? With an Enclave solution, there are cons, just like there are with any of these other options. You might still have aspects of your network in scope depending on your data flows. This was something when I was an auditor under PCI, we used to try really, really hard to keep all of our assets out of scope, because if you brought one connected asset into scope, then your whole network was back in scope. So you have to really look hard at what this is going to do for you in terms of reducing the scope. You might still have parts of your network that are going to be required to have the NIST 800-171 controls applied to it, just depending on your data flow. You know, if you're a manufacturer, you might require a connection for a manufacturing asset to a workstation asset, and an Enclave solution is not going to work at all for you. So you have to really look at these things when you're considering your options. With a managed service provider solution or with an Enclave solution, one of the things that I really stress is make sure that you understand what controls are still going to be your responsibility. You cannot outsource 100% of the NIST 800-171 controls. It is not possible. When you look at the specific categories, you can do a lot of them with a solid solution, either from an MSP or an Enclave provider, but you cannot do 100%. It's just not possible. So make sure when you're evaluating these solutions, you're asking what the shared responsibility matrix looks like. What am I going to be responsible for if I go into this solution? And then finally, you may decide that, you know, we want to do Enclave, we really need to keep our network out of scope. This might require a change to the way that you do business, right? Maybe it means that now we don't allow our users anymore to print documents. We require them to keep them digital. Or, you know, maybe we know that our users are using shared or they're using storage drives, portable storage drives to transport data. That might be something that we would have to look at, whether we can still allow that. You know, a great example is I work with a lot of clients who have personnel that go onto Navy ships. And when you get on a Navy ship, if you've never been on a Navy ship, there's not great Wi-Fi. And so it can be tricky with, you know, a solution that is an Enclave solution where if you're requiring, or if your data is in the cloud, it can be tricky. So you're going to have to look at, am I going to be able to download that to an asset? How does that change my scope? So it might require some changes to your business processes. But again, this can be a very cost-effective way to limit the requirements on your business network. And this is particularly good if your business network primarily serves commercial clients and the government aspects of this is just too burdensome for the commercial, you know, for the commercial side of your business. All right, so we've covered a lot today. I do want to leave a little bit of time just in case we have any questions. Leslie, with that, I can turn it over to you to you know, close us out.
Thank you all for joining our webinar. Thank you, Heather, for the great presentation. We will be sending out the recording and the slides in the follow-up email. If you have any questions after today, feel free to contact me.